Welcome to my fifth video. I'm going to do a quick recap and a couple of shout outs. First, I'll do some shout outs. Thanks Ned Dehaan for all the great content and positive support you give. Also to Neil Arnold, thanks for listening to me and bouncing ideas around. Drew Beerson, Ross Garassi, awesome work you guys do. Big shout out to Dave Barata from 2XX Radio, 93.8 People Powered Radio online and live. Go and check out his show Wednesday to Friday Lunchbox. And then also to Mix Bavo, thanks for listening to me and putting up with me when I chat about Zodiac at the pub. Now, as a quick recap, this may be my last video for a little while. Just wanted to go back through what we've learnt and looked at so far. The first video was really an overview of my thoughts on Zodiac's drafting and design ability. I went through crime scene locations, some of the comic and cultural references. We started tapping into some of the bus bomb diagrams and the letters, the style of communication, and how it aligns with a lot of design and engineering professions. I also focused on landscape architecture in the next couple of videos and did a deep dive into some of the diagrams, looking at electronics, engineering, site planning, how the diagrams were drawn using a light table and drafting equipment such as a T-square or roller ruler and triangular squares. We've had a look at the cards that he prepared that were all pen and ink or drawing, possibly something that he loved, this pen and ink and artistic side of things. All the crime scene locations were at parks or adjacent parks, and he mentions parks and he mentions a very spatial language in his letters. I've then gone through some of the ciphers and the letters, looking at the use of graph paper and light tables to prepare them as well, and looking at interesting observations around the gauge of graph paper that I think is a 1/4 inch, and demonstrate reasons why. And in this video I'm going to go through a bit more on those letters, how he actually drew up the letters and what kind of writing style he may have even had, because I don't really think it's that difficult to disguise his writing, particularly in the way he's drawn out things. There's still a repetition, there's still a neatness that comes through even in his sloppy writings with the misspellings. There's a demonstration of evidence that I think relates back to design, drafting, engineering, graphics. It's all really about graphics. He's sending in this multimedia graphic presentation of drawings and plans, ciphers, and these artsy crafty cards. So I hope you enjoy this last video. The other element that I'm going to really look at that I think has been overlooked in the Zodiac case is land survey, because there is a reason why I focused on the land. Holistically, his communications strongly suggest that not only is he a drafter and an engineer, but possibly someone who is a landscape architect or is involved with land survey, land management, urban planning, or is associated with someone that has those skills. Returning to the ciphers and the letters and this idea that he used graph paper, a light table to prepare quite a bit of his documentation and communications that he sent in. Now, last time I went through, there seems to be evidence that he used 1/4 inch graph paper, and I overlaid that over the 340 cipher and it fits perfectly. And the other thing that's quite interesting is you get the lines here where part of the cipher splits into the first part, second part, and then the third part down here, which is almost like a little 9. And also the crosshairs matches up really well with that center line. So let's have a look at the 408 cipher. This one's a little bit harder because it's a combined image of the three ciphers. Similar to the 340 cipher, it was actually split initially into three sections, and somewhere in the Photoshop of this it may not be perfect, but we can still see that this is how he's done the cipher, utilizing 1/4 inch graph paper. It may have been reduced in scale before he does the final print on a photocopy, so he can fit into his page nice and neatly and have these nice neat margins around the outside of his letter. This one's a little bit more difficult to track down because the various parts of the cipher were sent into various newspapers, so we don't have the original holistic complete design. So let's start applying this to the rest of his letters. He has a range of letters from quite neat to quite messy. There are letters that are early, there are letters that are a little bit later on in the early 70s. And then we'll also look at a few unauthenticated letters. So this is one of the early letters. I don't think it's his first one, and I'm not going to go through every single letter. I think you'll get the point really quickly that when we start overlaying the 1/4 inch graph paper, we start to see this same pattern, that he's using these nice neat gaps between writing, where I've got the yellow and the blue. It doesn't always quite line up depending on the letter. You can see this one, he starts to go off at an angle, but where he starts is really telling, everything's sort of lining up here with the Dear Editor quite neatly as he starts the letter. The first line is 2 blocks down, then he starts going into reasonably formal approach. He indents his writing down here, and then he indents it down here again. And what's really interesting to notice, and why I think there's graph paper behind this and a light table even for the letters, is the way he's done these numbers down here. And if it's behind on a light table, he doesn't have to follow it as perfectly as the cipher. He could be getting lazy, sloppy, or he's purposely making it look like that as he twists the page. But he starts quite neatly at the top and then starts losing it down at this point. But for the most part, early on, he's following that 1/4 inch graph. With the bus bomb, or one of the bus bomb diagrams and letters, we can see the same thing. This is much neater, and we have those nice 1/4 inch gaps for writing and in between. Now he could be using lined paper underneath, which is similar to a lot of people would write letters, but given the type of paper he's using, I feel like he's used a light table that makes it a lot more applicable to come through. There may have been another reason to use the light table too. For example, on this one he's got the clock with the crosses that may be victims or maybe different things. It's also worth noting that with the graph paper we could see how cleanly that crosshair lines up with part of the vertical and horizontal lines. And then we can also see on this one, he's developed it into a clock really. If you look closer, there's little dots where we don't have the X's. So at Royal, it's not perfect. He's approximately 60, 30 degrees. He's marking out either a clock or the 12 quadrants of the Zodiac. With the first bus bomb diagram and letter, we see the same thing. He's very neat in this particular letter. We can see all of those nice even gaps. He's even told us what page we're on, just like a sheet number in a documentation package. And again, we have this reasonably neat numbers down the side as he describes the components of his ridiculous bomb. In the last couple of videos I've gone through in detail looking at how he's used a light table to get his even line work, whether it's vertical and horizontal, that goes right across the page, whether it's down to the bottom right or the top left. He's always parallel or horizontally and vertically, and it appears, or the drawing he's done strongly suggests that he's used a light table, drafting equipment such as a T-square, 45 degree, 30-60 set squares. And we can see also when we put the graph paper behind, just where certain things line up, the edge of the section here and the row of bombs, they tend to line up fairly neatly where you have the vertical and horizontal lines of the graph paper underneath. Presidio Park letter, also really interesting when you put the 1/4 inch graph paper to scale underneath, is where he's got his dimension call out here, or projection. It's fairly close to being within the graph. Very well drawn vertically. He's probably flipped the page around as he writes it, obviously. And then we can see with this letter as well, like the previous, we've got that perfect 1/4 inch gaps between the writing. And he's reasonably neat with this particular letter. The same with the Times letter, which is a bit further down the track. Again, he starts losing his slope at times, but he always starts off fairly good, and we can see evidence of 1/4 inch graph paper again. In one of my previous videos I went through the angle of the writing is generally pretty consistent with drafting writing and that angle. And even if you look back at times, if you step back from the screen and you start almost blurring your eyes looking at this writing, you can see that there is some good repetition and rhythm in his writing. I've got a little list, slaves and map letter here. You can see how well the crosshairs fit in. They're very neat on this one, even though the circle is messy. And he etches in the little San Francisco Police Department 0, which is at 30 degrees. Some people think that might be him emphasizing a location if people aren't getting the code. It's certainly possible, and that would be worth looking into, especially the way he's drawn that crosshair so neatly. At least it enables one to gather that angle fairly succinctly, and then the rest of the letter we can see has the same 1/4 inch gaps. Same with the Dear Melvin letter. He doesn't write as slanted with this. He's very much up and down, more vertical. Very neat writing, almost like children's book writing, or when you first learn to write, and also similar to what we looked at in the technical drawing textbook. So quite interesting that when he writes to Melvin Belli, he's going for this much neater approach. But what I'm really looking at here is not so much why he's writing to Melvin, but again just that neatness, that he's providing us evidence that he's used either a light table, graph paper underneath, probably likely both. Presidio letter, same thing. Everything's neatly lining up. And then even the margins and the lettering and the numbers, they align. The 32 cipher letter, the same thing. We've got the ciphers all matching in with the 1/4 inch graph paper. And this is also quite a neat letter, similar to the Melvin Belli letter at the beginning. And then he starts getting slanted here and goes back to his normal writing at the very bottom. Exorcist letter was quite a lot later than his initial letters, yet we still see evidence of the same technique. Graph paper, 1/4 inch, possibly done over a light table. We can also see that with the 13 card. We went through this in some of my previous videos, how it's lined up, and you can just see how well this lettering has been lined up. I would not be surprised when he's cutting out all of this bits of newspaper article text, most likely using a knife, but could be using ciphers. It's very common for drafters to have a rubber mat or plastic mat cutting board to cut out various bits for collage, lettering, concept plans, and the like. Also, just the way certain things are lined up, both vertically and horizontally. Again, this is following that same grid pattern. This is following that same grid vertically. So I can't draw with a mouse very well. And when the 1/4 inch graph paper is overlaid, you can just see how you don't need to do a lot of guidelines when you've got graph paper underneath. It's doing it for you. Looking at a few really later letters into the late 70s and a few letters that are maybe not authenticated so much, we actually still see evidence of the same 1/4 inch graph paper. So I don't know if this is a real Zodiac letter or not, but just worth throwing the graph paper to scale underneath and seeing how that works. And we can see, while it's not perfect, there certainly starts off again with that nice gaps. And the same with the red phantom letter. We have fairly even spacing, especially with the red phantom letter. This one is really only good at the very beginning, and it starts to lose a little bit. You can also see just the way it starts. He starts writing almost upwards, like it's flowing up, whereas Zodiac tends to always start heading downwards in his slopes when he gets sloppy, lazy, whatever's happening. So I think there could be some evidence in the red phantom letter with the gaps that suggest that it could well be the real Zodiac writing this letter, given how well this works against, say, the Channel 9 letter. We can see the same thing in the Citizen letter. This seems to be fairly neat and organized in the gaps and the lettering following 1/4 inch graph paper. And my suspicion is that he's done not just the ciphers, but he's done all his communications using a light table graph paper and this backing. So he either has a spot, a home, basement, drawing board that he's got set up somewhere at an office late at night that he can get to if he's working, or 24 access to the design studios at a university if that's what he's doing. Alright, so I reckon how Zodiac did his writing is one letter at a time in this kind of rhythm. He can follow graph paper to keep his flow. He can change angles on things like the D. You'll also notice that Zodiac, rather than doing formal drafting, architectural engineering, where the M's go all the way down, he'll sometimes have the M's stroked up high, which is actually similar to ARMY fonts and cryptography fonts. And then with the S, he'll sometimes have a long tail. With the D, he'll sometimes have cursive, or it will be angled right over. And then he quite often has those two narrow double L's, almost like hatching. So Zodiac also does almost cursive F's like this. And also when you do this kind of fast staccato style, single letter at a time, you tend to get gaps between words and letters, which we see in Zodiac's writing. He's also really confident in his line work when he puts his pen to page. He doesn't hesitate where you end up with a dot, and he's never too fast where the line just disappears and gets scratchy. He's always really confident in his freehand ability. That sort of thing. Let's talk about land survey. Land survey is directly linked back to landscape architecture and civil engineering and land management. What we've been talking about over the last couple of videos. It's directly linked both to the planning and design of environments such as a bridge and a road, or a reservoir and water and land management, contours, all sorts of different types of infrastructure planning. It's also related to the fact that in the old days they required documentation to prepare survey plans. An understanding of the site, its dimensions, the tracts of land that the development will occur on, and how to manage that. And in my profession, you can't start work until you've done a site analysis and you've obtained a survey where you can see the contours and you can start to grade the site and you can start to design a site that is functional. There's also the geometry in surveying that is consistent with what we've been going through in the last few videos. It's simple geometry in many ways, but it's also highly complex. The zodiac symbol of the circle and crosshairs. Now, while zodiac and that symbol really only come together with the watch, the zodiac watch, zodiac has used this symbol in multiple other ways, and particularly surrounding the Phillips 66 map, its code and cipher and subsequent letters that were sent in that he talked about. And he used much larger radius diagrams when he was doing those letters, which we'll go through. And what is remarkable is he does tell us information. He leaves evidence of who he is in his Phillips 66 map, that in conjunction with his letters and the bus bomb diagrams and drawings and the artsy crafty cards start to paint a picture of actually who he is. It's also worth noting he picked up this use of radians, and we're going to go into some detail around radians. And here's a simple conversion chart that allows one to see degrees versus radians, and the correlation or relationship between 360 degrees and the circumference, and radians is really 2 pi. So 180 degrees is 1 pi, which is 3.14. So together they make approximately 6.3 as the circumference of the circle versus 360 degrees. There's also the aspect of which direction you're looking at, or how you manage and address the mathematics behind the circumference of the circle. The classic way, of course, is having 0 degrees going around to 360 degrees, which then divides into minutes and seconds, 60 minutes and 60 seconds. And then we have also quadrants, which is more your north, south, east, west. And there it's divided more into 90 degree angles. So you would say, if you were going off in this direction, you would say something along the lines of north 45 degrees west. Whereas in this you might say, well, you're going off 315 degrees. So a survey deals with angles and dimensions, just like Zodiac's 66 map, whereas compass sort of surveying and navigation uses the north-south, east-west scenario. So it's really important to keep in mind, are we dealing with north, south, east, west, or are we dealing with angles? And how are those angles measured? Well, Zodiac tells us radians and inches. He doesn't say north, south, east, west. So my personal belief when you look through his communications is the evidence that he left us is land surveying. And again, I put up images such as these with the tape measure, a chain-inch tape measure, that you have also just a consistency in language with the cross that relates back to the compass. So there's a unified approach to his holistic design between the comic book references, Dr. Zodiac, the TV and movies, all that sort of thing coming through into this vocational, technical realm. And surveying has a rich history. It has been around for a long time, and similar to some of the geometry we've gone through before, it's all based off Pythagoras and trigonometry. The 60 degree and the 30 degree and the 90 degree and the 45 degree, the circumference of a circle. In many ways it's very basic stuff, but at the same time, the way that Zodiacs utilize this stuff, there are so many elements that cross over into his visual language, and he hasn't just drawn diagrams and sent cards. The fact that he has sent in a map and sent in instructions that are surveying instructions, in my opinion, not navigation or military instructions, they're surveying instructions. And I will demonstrate why I think that. I think this is evidence that Zodiac left and probably didn't even think at the time how relevant it all is. But when we look back on the equipment, the geometry, the history of surveying, and the relationship it has with land and land management, and how close and how much land surveying is really part of landscape architecture, I think it's really quite a unique theory, or something that's very compelling, even when we look at some surveying equipment that use telescopes and staffs to record and measure. There's the same language. They're called crosshairs. You sight in on a station, on a point, and again, this geometry that comes through is consistent. I've looked at a lot of old textbooks again, like I have with engineering and landscape architecture and design, and these textbooks I've primarily chosen from the 50s and 60s. That's what Zodiac, if he had been inspired or influenced by surveying or was doing units in surveying as part of his course, we'll be looking at. However, a lot of this information goes back hundreds if not thousands of years, because it comes back to that Freemasonry aspect of things we were talking about before, not the Illuminati and conspiracy side of that, but more the practical side of how do you build cities, buildings, landscapes, utilities. And looking back over all these diagrams, we start to get a picture of the principles and processes and the practice of survey. We also start to pick up some of the esoteric elements where it relates to polar arcs or solar compasses, and how part of that esoteric and even astrological, the zodiac, starts to fit in. Because while I don't really read my astrology charts they are based on some principles of how the equinoxes and astronomy works and mathematics. And again, just the diagrammatic approach to surveying is really an extension of landscape architecture, civil engineering. The same instruments you use, protractors and set squares, parallel rules, different scaled rules and compasses, exactly like the Freemasonry symbol, because it's all coming back to this 45 degree or 60-30 degree angles. Surveying also, given its rich history, has a lot of different terminology. For example, in the past, chainage was used as a particular measure. We spoke about that in some of my previous videos relating to road design and the chainage of roads, and that relates back to documentation that would be related between civil engineering, landscape architecture, electrical engineering, hydraulic engineering, that sort of thing. And chainage is another form of measurement, similar to how you have a different types of measurement between radians and degrees. And this is a very common measurement process in the past, where it's almost like a tape measure. You have literal chains between that have a measurement on them, and they can be laid out to survey the land, at least in a horizontal aspect. You'll also notice that quite often the rule of surveying is to try and use a 60-degree angle wherever possible when making up triangles to survey a tract of land. And the process of using chainage is not just for roads and grading design, but also it covers town planning, urban planning, and surveying of land ready for a new development. Naturally, any designer, whether it's an engineer or a landscape architect or an architect working on a site, needs to know the lay of the land, all of the site constraints and opportunities. And we can see that here again with contouring, with survey. It's also to pick up contour levels. In my profession as a landscape architect, the first thing that I look at is the site analysis, and then I look at a survey. I can't do anything until I've got that survey and the contours, and then I can reshape the land and manipulate or conserve areas as part of the design. And we can see here that road engineering section again relating back to land survey. We also went through in one of my videos landscape architecture course and how it includes survey as well as land planning and geology and that type of analysis of the landscape. And here we can see landscape architects from Cal Poly Pomona executing exactly that, and this is from the late 60s. So there is direct evidence that landscape architecture was involved with survey as a subject, and you can see the instruments they're using, the sextant and telescope and staffs and different stations to map out their directions or points that they're trying to survey. They would have experience with the basics of survey. Now that brings us back to radians. Now, as we talked about before, we have this correlation between radians and degrees. The circumference of a circle is 2 pi, 180 degrees is 1 pi, 3.14 over a circumference. It ends up to be about 6.3, 2 pi. And the relationship back to degrees or the sexagesimal system, is that you have this division of 360 degrees, which is usually measured clockwise. Now, a lot of people think that radians are really rare and that Zodiac must have been using radians to sound really tough and knowledgeable, and or that most of the public don't know about radians. Now, this might be true, but in land survey they're fairly common, and they're also common in many other applications to do with design engineering. They're really common in electrical engineering, for example. If anyone uses AutoCAD programs, all those calculations and angles are done in radians discreetly behind the scenes by the computer software. But they're not the only ones, the 360 degrees and the radians, 2 pi. There are other types of systems that are used commonly in drafting, design, and engineering. One that's probably more common than the last one is the centesimal system, which divides the circumference of a circle into 400. So each quarter or quadrant you have 100, and that basically brings it back to centimeters and the metric system. We then also have the military system, mils, and that is divided into 6,400 or above. It goes even higher, up to like 260,000, and that's used for applications such as military artillery bombings, where you need to be very precise. Now, if Zodiac wanted to be military, and if he was military, why not use the mil system? Or if he wanted to be more rare other than radians, he could have used the centesimal system, which is basically gradients, grades, or gons, which brings it back to 100 per square and matches in with his logo, his crosshairs. What he talked about in his letter was radians and inches, and on the map he drew a more of a clock face, which we'll go through later, the 0, 3, 6, and 9. Now, that has more of a relationship with the sexagesimal system, 360 degrees. However, what he's talking about in terms of the measurement is radians. So he's swapping between those two, but we'll get to the significance of 0, 3, 6, and 9 later, which is really, it's clockwise. He's given us directions for it being clockwise versus the quadrant system or bearing navigation system of north, south, east, west. And it's important to know some of the mathematics behind this. I think a lot of people involved in the case understand that a radian is 57.3 degrees. It's also really important to know minutes and seconds, because that will relate back to the decimal, and also because radians also use minutes and seconds. So a radian isn't just its own complete. There is also, when you go into decimals, they can be notated as minutes and seconds. Then we have the decimal place, where it goes a bit further. It's been rounded up from 57.29578 to 57.3. The 17 minutes and 45 seconds, you can see how that translates when we do 1 degree equals 0.01745 radians. So there's the link between the seconds and minutes system and the decimal system. And then, as we mentioned before, 1 radian is in 180 degrees pi, 3.14, and then over 360 is 2 pi, or 2 pi divided by 360 equals 1 degree, which is then divided by 60 equals 1 minute. The decimal divided by 60 equals 1 second. And radians are kind of ideal actually to measure arc length, which is the length of an arc when dealing with pi or when dealing with calculations such as geodetic. And where it relates to pi is basically if you have the radius of a circle equals the same as the arc, if they're the same dimension, you have 1 radian. So we spoke about bearings before in relation to navigation, and one of the reasons why I don't feel like this is navigation is because the Zodiac is not dividing the circumference of the circle he drew on this Phillips 66 map into north, south, east, west. He's done it in a mathematical alignment of 0, 3, 6, 9, which tends to allude to the Phillips map needing to be read in the simplistic terms of a whole circle bearing, which is essentially clockwise all the way around to the angle, whether it's 1 degree or 359 degrees. Another interesting thing in looking back over these old survey textbooks is in one of the textbooks I came across from the 1950s or early 60s has this arrow with the fletching and its articulating movement. We can also see this in the same textbook. It's only one textbook I came across. Possibly its graphics are simply copied from Technical Drawing by Frederick Gassike. But either way, I thought that was quite cool to find. And again, that's what the Zodiac used in his bus bomb diagram to show the clock going round. So again, this is consistency of where did he get inspiration? Where did he get his influence from? And I think it's from all of these textbooks that I've been showing you in these videos. It's a holistic planning exercise. Now, a whole circle bearing, different to the 4 quadrants, north, south, east, west, and 90 degree elements, tends to look at the angle going the whole way around. So between the base station or polar point, you have the whole circle bearing going around all the way. And I think that's what Zodiac has done with his Phillips 66 map. As we can see here, he hasn't given us much to work with, but he has provided the key elements of what we need. He's taken the Phillips 66 road map. It's a very broad map, but it does have the scale on it. And he's provided this north point. And there's quite a lot of unique things in this tiny bit of information. Let's have a look at it. The first is he's given us a reference point. Before you do any survey, you need to have a reference line. Now, this map doesn't have a grid like a topographical map or a 1 to 25,000 map. It does have a north point, it does have the scale, but there's no grid. He's done this as essentially an arbitrary line. He's done his calculation from the base station, I guess you could call it, of Mount Diablo, but it's arbitrary. In a way, it's also astronomical and geodetic because it's based off Mount Diablo that has a particular point. So he's actually kind of double up on both of those. But either way, he could have said it anyway. He could have done his circle down here and done that as the arbitrary line and said that whatever angle needs to be measured from this point. So he understands that Mount Diablo is a geodetic point that is important in California mapping and surveying, he understands it's also part of the astronomical meridian line. The second meridian line he talks about is magnetic north, which he mentions here, and as many people involved with the Zodiac case will know, that's about 1670 degrees off here for 1969, and that's really just, if you had a compass, the magnetic needle at the observer's position. So if you were standing at the top of Mount Diablo in front of the Zodiac dome, that would be your observer's position, and if you pointed a compass in 1969, it would point off in this direction, like so. We then have the third piece of information that he's given us, which is the azimuth, or he's given us a reference point of these numbers around the circle, which is 0369, which is basically a clockwise angle from the north end of the reference meridian, which is the map north. How you flip it around to magnetic north is pretty simple, and it really comes down to the radians, an angle, and the measurement in inches, which can be worked out from the bottom of the map that's off this screen to work out the length. But it's really important to understand this flow of information which is going round clockwise, because in navigation, and I've read online a lot of people talking about bearings being north-south, and it really comes back to land survey when we look at this map. In the details he's given us, he's given us exactly what a land survey needs: a reference point, the indication of the code, and the dimensions or the direction is going to be based off magnetic north and the azimuth. Alright, so what's worth noting in some of Zodiac's communications around this time of the Phillips map is he sends in a number of really large crosshairs. These are in some of the subsequent letters. Now it's possible he's giving further clues, as many people have tried to discover for either these crime scenes shifting around on the map do match up to certain crime scene locations. We've also got the clock hours coming through in here, or it's a division of 12, maybe for the Zodiac horoscope, who knows. What's important to note, I think, is just how clean these crosshairs are drawn. Now again, these letters could be drawn over graph paper, but even still he's kept the circles fairly messy, but actually the crosshair itself, especially where it crosses over at that apex, is incredibly neat and parallel up and down, vertically and horizontally. So that's sort of worth considering. Whether all three of these have some hints to solving the cipher, or whether he's playing his games. The bottom left down here is 30 degrees, about 4.2 radian. Again, it's interesting to use this radian. It's not completely unique or unknown in the world of survey and design and engineering. If he was a military guy, he could have used mils, and the relationship between mils, which is where a circumference is divided into 6,400 parts, and radians is 1 mil is 1,000th of a radian. So that's the correlation between those two values. So yeah, I haven't really looked at the code here too much. A lot of the symbols seem similar to the 408 cipher. It may be that code's going to contain the word radians. It may also contain minutes and seconds. It's really hard to know. There's also not enough unusual symbols, I think, in here that might start breaking up the cipher into chunks of different words that might become a number. I'm not really sure. I haven't looked at the ciphering on this, but it may be worth looking back at this crosshair here, given it's so neat, whether there's a hidden clue, again, and the mount following this one over here. So I'm not sure if I really see Zodiac as being some kind of mad scientist. I don't really see him as being some kind of truck driver. He's got a lot of time on his hands and he's putting in a lot of effort into all these communications. As I've said before in previous videos, I don't really think he's a guy who's actually in the army, but he might have some military experience which possibly might explain some of this surveying as well. I think he's someone who's more connected to the land through this survey due to the language he's used and what he's provided us in this evidence. I think he's someone who's more closely linked to the land.